Folks, thanks very, very much for joining us this evening for our talk about the highs and lows of peatland restoration. So my name's Roisin Donnelly, and we also have Simon Gray on here. And we're both senior technical officers working in peatlands and Ulster wildlife. So we've been doing, you've probably come along to some of the other talks that we've been doing over the past few weeks. So we're delighted to be able to just explain some of the work that we've been doing on the peatlands, and I know we've got quite a few members on here this evening too, so it's great for you to see what some of your contributions are doing to help our peatlands here in Northern Ireland. I'll just go through a few housekeeping points first. So the talk will be about 30 minutes. And then we'll have 30 minutes for questions as well. If you've got any questions as we go along, there's a little question and answer box. If you want to pop them in there as we go along, we might break halfway through and answer a few of them. And at the end, we'll go through all of them, but please pop them in as we go along. So the talk is also being recorded, and we're going to share it to participants and Ulster Wildlife members after. So please keep your video switched off if you don't wish to be recorded. You're all muted during the talk, but again, if you've any comments or questions, just stick them into that chat facility and we'll definitely come back to them. And yeah, we get started and really hope you enjoy the talk. So the other thing then that we're going to be doing throughout, just to keep everyone engaged, is we've got little questionnaires going throughout and polls. So the way you can join them is really easy. You can open another tab on your laptop or on your phone and go to slido.com, and you'll see a little box at the top to add in a code. And so the code is there, UW bogs. You also, if you've got your smartphone beside you, you can scan that QR code and join from there as well. So slido.com, and then just use the UW bogs, or else scan it from your phone. So what we're going to cover tonight is what is the peatland, why they're important, why they need our help, and some of the work that Ulster Wildlife have been doing and what we've learned as we've went along. So we'll be looking at the blanket bog restoration that we've been doing on Cuilcagh Mountain, and then also at some of the lowland blanket bog or lowland bog restoration that Simon has been working on. So just to test out then, if you're able to use Slido then, if you can log on there, and we've got a wee question up, and it's what words would you use to describe a bog? So try and keep it to 1 or 2 words max, and we'll start to see some answers popping up. Yeah, peaty, absolutely. So we'll give you a couple of seconds to try it out. Soggy, absolutely. Although I was up on Cuilcagh today and it is very dry after that nice weather. Wet is definitely winning out, absolutely. Swampy, soggy, yeah. Biodiverse, yeah, we've got some, as we'll talk about in the rest of the presentation, we've got some really rare and important wildlife that we find in our peatlands here because they're such rare habitats. Definitely the biodiversity we get there is really important. Rich, mucky, yeah, definitely wet is winning out here. I think Simon and I could both attest to that.
It says a lot.
Yeah, beautiful, absolutely. You'll see Simon has got some lovely photos from the bogs and on his drone, so you'll see them going through it, and they're pretty stunning. Great. Grand. So at least we know that it's working and you're able to get on there. Let us know if you're having any bother in the chat, and hopefully Simon might be able to answer some of your questions in there about it and get you on. Great. So what is a peatland? So a peatland is a type of wetland habitat that forms when the vegetation that's grown on the surface can only partially decompose because the conditions are so wet. And it's all that partially decomposed plant material builds up in layers, and that forms our peat. So the peatlands here in Northern Ireland, that's thousands of years of peatland vegetation that's been built up over time, and therefore thousands of years of carbon as well. Sphagnum moss is the main peat peat building plant that we get in our bogs. So it's this lovely multicolored carpet, kind of like a Persian rug covering the bog underneath your feet, and they come in all these beautiful different colors. And it's our main bog builder. So they grow from the tip and they die from the base, and then it's that layering of all that partially decomposed, mainly sphagnum moss, and that's forming our peat. We've got 3 different types of peatlands here in Northern Ireland. So we've got our blanket bog, which cloaks our upland areas. Then we've got our raised bogs, which are those kind of dome-shaped bogs that you get dotted throughout the lowlands. And they're both rain-fed, you call them, so they get most of their water from rain. And then we also have our fens, and they're slightly different in that what causes their waterlog in wet conditions, it's actually the groundwater. The raised bogs have been grown for around 10,000 years, and peat grows at about 1 centimetre a year. So you can imagine when we've got some that are 10 and 12 metres deep, that's kind of how we can know how long that they've been there for. And they need quite a lot of rainwater when it comes to our blanket bogs, especially. So it's said to be about 1,200 millimetres of rain for over 235 days a year. So you can see why we need them to be quite wet, and that's mainly because of these sphagnum moss as well needs the conditions to be quite wet. And then anything that impacts the hydrology of these bogs, anything that dries them out or destroys that surface vegetation, negatively impacts the condition of the bog and its ability to be what's known as active. So when a bog is active, it means that it's actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere and laying it down as peat. And when it's in a degraded condition, we're starting to lose all that carbon that's locked up in the peat back into the atmosphere, or it's been washed off the mountain or from our bogs. You'll often hear people referring to peatlands as being our equivalent to rainforest here in the UK and Ireland. So they cover about 3% of the Earth's surface, but they store twice as much carbon as all the world's forests combined. So they're our largest terrestrial carbon store. The UK and Ireland has about 20% of the world's blanket bog resource. So that's really quite significant when you see how tiny we are in comparison. And you can see here that peatlands cover, they're kind of in every climatic zone as well. The peatlands cover about 12% of Northern Ireland. So you can kind of see why they're so important then, both in terms of our fight against climate change and carbon storage, but also for the biodiversity here. And when they're in a healthy condition, they're really important, as I was saying before, for carbon, but also in terms of reducing flash flooding downstream, and then of course for the biodiversity resource. So you can see here some of the amazing plants and animals that we're getting in these habitats. So for example, up in Cuilcagh where we're working, we get quite a lot of red grouse, and we also have this lovely little golden plover bird. It's a nice gold speckled little bird that we would get both overwintering, but Cuilcagh Mountain that we've been working on is one of its last remaining breeding sites, and there's estimated to be only 16 to 20 pairs left in Northern Ireland, and that's probably an out of date estimate. Still breeding. So Cuilcagh is a really important stronghold for them at the moment. Obviously our lovely hen harrier bird as well, common lizard and Argent sable moths. So yeah, because they're quite rare habitats and habitats that are under pressure at the moment, you can imagine then that the biodiversity and the flora and fauna that we're getting there are also under pressure. So all the work that we've been doing to restore our peatlands is obviously having a benefit for the wildlife that we're fighting up there as well. So another little Slido poll here, if you can log on in and just let us know what you think are the biggest issues facing our peatlands here in Northern Ireland at the moment. So we've got drainage, turf cutting, fire, grazing issues, erosion, recreation pressure, climate change, invasive species, and milling for horticulture. Oh, disappeared there. Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well, when we're looking at some of the fires that we're seeing in the moorns at the moment, when you're getting weather like this, that's obviously very significant pressure for our upland habitats. Yeah, drainage is definitely a big one. Like as I was saying earlier, those wee sphagnum mosses that are important for building their peat really need the conditions to be wet. So anything that's reducing that water table is definitely having a big impact. Yeah, that would be fairly common to what we're seeing across the sites. So yeah, absolutely. The stuff that you're coming up with there, definitely. Like it's estimated that 88% of Northern Ireland's bogs are considered to be in a degraded or damaged state, and the pressures are definitely the likes of drainage. So we've been doing a lot of work to block drains. Things like overgrazing in our uplands is definitely a significant issue on some sites. Afforestation, so conifers then, when they're planted close to our peatland sites, we can often find little self-seeding conifers creeping out onto the bog. So not only are they drying out the peatlands, but they also act as a perching post for some of our avian predators and some of the ground nesting birds. So we definitely don't like to see those creeping out onto the bog. Things like wildfires, so as I was saying, anything that kind of takes away that surface vegetation and that peat building vegetation, that can also expose the peat underneath. So we don't like to be seeing fires going on up in our blanket bog areas for sure. Simon's going to be talking a little bit about rhododendron as a big issue on some of our sites, and it outshades our peatland vegetation as well and dries out the bog. Yeah, there's a huge number of impacts that are happening on our peatland sites, but Ulster Wildlife have been working really hard to restore some of these precious habitats across Northern Ireland. So we have a couple of nature reserves that we be working on through support from our members. But I suppose what me and Simon here are talking about today is our work on this project called CAN. So CAN was funded through EU Interreg funding, and we're one of 11 partners working on the project. There's 27 different sites that we're working on, peatland and wetland sites across, you can see here, Northern Ireland, the border counties of Ireland and Scotland. So one of the sites I'm going to be talking about today that we've been working on is actually Cuilcagh Mountain, which is one of 3 cross-border sites. And the whole idea was writing these management plans for what needs to be done to bring these sites back into good condition again. But we were also doing a lot of direct work on the ground. And so we're heading towards this target of 3,650 hectares of these peatland habitats restored. So a really huge project. It's finishing up now in September. And this is the work that we've been doing up on Cuilcagh then. So erosion control on Cuilcagh Mountain. So you can see here lots of this bare peat. And this is a big gully system. And then these are really steep, bare, eroding edges. So you can imagine that on such a sheer edge, it's really hard for vegetation to take hold. And if you've got this water running through, again, it's very hard for vegetation to take hold. And all of this peat and therefore carbon is being washed off the mountain. And then when you've got areas sitting up like this that are dry, that carbon's been lost into the atmosphere, and it creates really harsh conditions for plants to take hold and root into, because you can imagine in the warm weather it dries out, in the freezing weather it freezes and cracks. So it's not the ideal conditions that we want to see for our peatland plants to be able to get rooted into again. So what we did was we trained up 2 local landowners. This is Aidan and Terry McGovern. And they're both contractors themselves and had their own machinery. And so we trained them up to actually do the work up on the mountain. So it's been great to get their local knowledge, especially knowledge of the site. And they've been really proud to be able to work essentially what they call their backyarding, and they want to be proud of the land that they farm. So it's been a really good partnership for us. So the first thing that we did was fly LiDAR. And basically what LiDAR is a laser that's bounced down onto the ground, and when it bounces back up, that signal is collected and it creates this sort of 3D map of the site, which you can see here. And what this really helps us understand then is the topography and where the water is flowing on the site, and helps us map out some of those really steep edges that I was showing there. So this is the kind of maps that we're left with. So all of these little yellow areas that you're seeing, that was where we'd mapped out those bare steep edges. So 7 kilometres of those, which is quite significant. We could only actually access about 2 kilometres of them with the digger. And I'll show you what we do when we're getting in there with the digger to try and deal with those issues. So that technology is really, really powerful in helping us quickly map all of those areas and plan out what we're going to do when we get onto the ground. So the first job then is to reprofile the bare edges so that they're nice gentle slopes for vegetation to be able to grow on again. And it covers all this bare edge and stops it continuing to erode. So the digger comes in and basically scoops away or peels back that overhang, grades out the steep edge, and then puts that vegetation back on the top again and pats it all down, so you can really see how much of a difference that's making, and that's all that peat now protected from erosion. And then a few more examples. There is a really steep edge, really bare, all graded back out again. But sometimes it doesn't always go to plan. So as you can imagine, trying to use a digger to do such intricate work, you can't get every single bit covered. And sometimes you just don't even have enough vegetation to get it covered. So what we did then was had to go in and do handwork. So we borrowed little turfs of vegetation from other areas and brought them in to patch up the bare sections. So this is kind of before and after when we do that work, and it makes a really big difference. It's obviously quite time consuming. We spent 3 weeks doing that up there, but we got a little bit of help from some of our amazing Ulster wildlife volunteers, and they made it a lot quicker and a lot easier, and definitely a lot more fun as well. The next thing we do then is we want to look at all of that bare peat that's in the basin of the gully. So again, we use LiDAR, and all these little red lines are the flow paths that are going through that bare peat. And from that, we can see then where we need to try and hold that water back. And we do this using coir rolls. So these are our coir rolls. We actually installed over 400 of them on Cuilcagh. And basically what the coir rolls do is they're actually the husk of a coconut, all squished together really, really tight into these sort of long sausage shapes. And when the water flows through them, it traps all that peat sediment in behind. So that's sediment that stays there for our vegetation to take root on and stabilize. And it slowly lets the water through. And it creates these really shallow pools in behind, which again is what our peatland plants love. And you dig them in slightly into the bank and into the ground so that the water can't go underneath or around them. And this is another technique that we use, and it just shows you how quick that the water can build up. So that this was like a fish scale technique that we used for little small ponds, and really straight away you can see the water building up, and that was a day after we'd installed them. So really, really quick results, and you can kind of see the scale of the work that we were doing up there, and the scale of actually the bare peat that we were dealing with. It was over a 17-hectare area in total. Again, loads of lovely water being trapped in behind, and this was after just 1 year, so we were already starting to see the vegetation build up after just 1 year. And that's quite significant because these habitats, the vegetation on them grow quite slowly. So we were delighted to see the results already. There's still more work to do. We want to get back up, patch in some areas where some of the vegetation might have slipped. Also, we've started to notice different flow paths that we didn't see before. We want to get up there and do a little bit more work on that, but we're doing ongoing fixed point photography to try and see the change over time. So just to show you a couple of these to see the impact that the work's having already after just a year. So yeah, you can see this is before and after amount of water that's actually building up. So I don't think people would realize how much water is flowing through there until you actually see with the coir rolls we've put in the difference that it makes. And yeah, same here. So obviously, like I was saying there, that it's made from coconut husk. It is a byproduct of the coconut industry, and there's been studies showing that the carbon footprint of taking that material in is offset really quickly, even with having to helicopter materials in, and because of the amount of carbon that you're making sure it's not being washed off the mountain or released into the atmosphere. It's offset quite quick, but we always want to be just improving that carbon footprint even more. So we've decided to trial sheep wool as an alternative to coir. It's local. Farmers are finding it difficult to find a market for it. It's already used sometimes in restoration pathwork. But the big thing is knowing how long is it going to stay in place, because the coir should be there for 5 to 10 years. So the real test is the wool going to stay in place long enough for that peatland vegetation to get back and the roots to stabilise the peat. The next thing that we were doing then was drain blocking. So there was over 6 kilometres of drains in this other area of Cuilcagh that we were working on. And again, we used the LiDAR, and from the LiDAR, we were able to map all of the drains. And then all these little green dots are where we were advised to put dams. So we had hydrologists look at all this data, and then they came up with restoration plans. So every little green dot's a dam. There was over 300 dams recommended, and they were all peat dams. And this is what it looks like when it was done. So the idea is that you borrow some peat from a little borrow pit at the edge of the drain. And the reason why we do that is because the peat is a lot wetter than taking peat from inside the drain, which means that it's going to be better at making a really good dam that's not going to fail. And then we put that inside the drain and put vegetation on top of the dam that we've made to make sure that it doesn't dry out and crack. And then we kind of stitch back in our borrow pits again. And you can see there all of the water that's been held up in those drains. I was just up there today, and even in the really, really dry conditions that we have at the moment, the water is still right up there in the drains and doing the job. The dams are really doing the job that they were put in for. Yeah, so these are some of the results that we're seeing. Lots of lovely full drains with sphagnum in them already, and our borrow pits are knitting back together quite nicely. So it'll take a couple of years now for the borrow pits to knit back together, but the dams are already definitely doing the job. And I just love this image because it looks like we've stitched the bog back together, which is kind of essentially what we have done. And it lends itself to this whole saying of a stitch in time saves 9. So getting in there now and doing it while we can and locking all that carbon away and all the biodiversity benefits that brings with it. And the other thing then that we're doing is we want to make sure that it's having an impact. And the way that we do that is to look at the water table. So as I was saying before, the vegetation on the peatlands grows quite slowly. So it could take a couple of years before we'd actually see the impacts on the ground. And so what we did was water table monitoring then. And that's all these yellow dots on our maps, all the red dots are dams. And then all of the yellow dots across the site are where we've been monitoring the water table. And the reason we do that is because we want it to be within the first 5 to 10 centimetres for most of the year. So what we do is go along with what's called, it's very technical, it's copper plopper, but a copper pipe on the end of a measuring tape. And we put it into this tube that we put in the ground with slots along it. And we measure how far from the surface the water table is. And then we've got little automatic loggers that are in there doing it every 15 minutes. So we've been doing that before and after the drain blocking. As I say, I was up there today, and even with after a year or after a week of really dry weather, we had the water table at 10 centimetres from the surface. So that is a really quick whistle-stop tour of the work that we did up on Cuilcagh Mountain through the CAN project. And Simon is going to go through some of the lowland peatlands work that we were doing. But maybe we should stop for a wee second, Simon, and see if there's any questions before we move on.
There hasn't been many questions there, but Paul's just asked a couple of things there. So as if he was anticipating that you were directly going to move on to it, and before you mentioned the 88%, Phil asked how much of the 12% of the peatlands in NI were degraded. So
yeah.
about 88% of our peatlands, so 88% of that 12% are, so effectively most of them. And most of our designated peatland SSIs are actually in unfavourable condition as well.
Yeah.
And then just about the Garran Plateau. So that's actually our biggest area of blanket bog in the whole of Ireland. Massive, massive site, over 4,000 hectares. And it's actually been in unfavourable condition in the past due to things like overgrazing, but there's been a lot of restoration work that's gone on there over the past number of years. Our SPV's done a lot of work there with water blocking drains, and they've actually really improved the efficiency of the water treatment there as a result. So that's a real great case study. Finally, just asked then if there was any visits to our sites coming up. And unfortunately, a lot of the sites that we've been working on over the past wee while are on private land, but a number of them you can kind of get a bit of a glimpse into. So I mean, the stuff on Cuilcagh you can see from the boardwalk. So once you start up the stairs and you look over towards Lockatona, you can see the coir logs and a lot of the restoration work. So that's a good way to see that one. And one that's actually really easy to see is Peatlands Park. So I'll touch on Peatlands Park in a wee minute, but it's got lots of access around it, and we've been doing work in there on a number of different fronts over the past wee while. So it's one that people can go and see quite easily. Yeah. Will I dive?
Great. Yeah, do you want to dive into the lowland stuff now then?
So as Roisin's already pointed out then, we've got a few different types of peatland habitats across Northern Ireland, and Roisin's really covered the blanket bogs, the upland peatlands in a lot of detail there. So I'm going to cover then the raised bogs and the fens, and largely raised bogs because it's been what we've been working on, and they're much more common across Northern Ireland than fens are. And there's a few key differences, obviously, other than the fact that blanket bogs are in the upland areas, and lowland peatlands like raised bogs and fens are in the lowlands. But raised bogs, they as Roisin already pointed out, they tended to form in areas of stagnant water, which appeared after the ice retreated after the last ice age. So just before around 10, sort of 12,000 years ago, the ice melted, retreated, and left a lot of these sort of troughs where water collected and didn't really have anywhere to go. Gradually over time, the vegetation just crept in and crept in and crept in until it formed a mat over the top. And that mat then just grew and grew and grew, as Roisin's pointed out with the sphagnum moss. And eventually you get raised bogs. And a big difference then between these lowland raised bogs and the blanket bogs. Blanket bogs tend to be somewhere in the region of about 50 centimeters deep to maybe about a few meters deep, whereas lowland raised bogs tend to be a lot deeper. So the deepest one that we've ever done a coir on, where we put drills down in order to measure the depth, is Clara Bog, which is actually the bottom bog in that picture, which is way out near Drumquin. And we had 10.5 meters of coring rods, and we didn't hit the bottom. So as Roisin said, there's about a meter is about 1,000 years. So there's 10,500 years worth of peat, which is formed there, and probably more then underneath. And then fens are very different altogether then. And we tend to get most of our fens actually in County Down in Northern Ireland, less so raised bogs in the part of the world that I'm from. And they form basically, as Roisin said, with the groundwater coming up underneath, but you get that mat of vegetation then forming over the top. And I always think of it like a skin on custard. Most of it is actually water underneath, but there's a thin skin of vegetation on the top. So that's what makes them very wobbly. So we'll move on to the next one then. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the pressures then, and some of the issues on some of these sites then, as Roisin has already outlined for some of the upland ones. So drainage, as you already all pointed out very correctly, is probably the biggest problem. And the key with that is because, as you already also pointed out, the key attribute of bogs is being wet, and drains obviously hinder being wet. So we want the water table of the peatlands to be within 5 and 10 centimeters, or within 10 centimeters of the surface for 90% of the year. That's when it's happy. Drains, as you can see from this one on the left here in Cranny Bogs, and then the one on the right out in the Ferry Water Bogs out in Tyrone, that water table is much lower than within 10 centimeters of the surface. And it's during the summertime in particular that they really cause a lot of harm. So those are one of the biggest issues that we focus on when we carry out restoration work. but it's not the only one. One of the things that we've got actually consultants, hydrologists to look at is the restorability of lowland raised bogs. So a lot of bogs that were, say, down in the Midlands of Ireland, which have been heavily modified, heavily cut for turf in the past, actually the more modified they've become through drainage and turf cutting and burning and planting and that sort of stuff and improvement for agriculture, the harder they end up being to restore. What we get here on the likes of cranny bogs, which is on this slide, the flatter they are, then the easier they are to restore. So you see there in the middle area, basically this slope, it shows how flat the bog is, and the easier it is then to keep water on the site and stop it from getting away. So the flatter the bog is, the easier it is to restore. Now that's theoretically, sometimes actually in practice that doesn't end up being correct because the flatter a bog is, usually the wetter it is, and that means sometimes it's very hard to work on. But in theory, the flatter it is, the easier it is to restore. And it shows us then where the best places to focus our efforts are. So if you have areas which are very, very steeply sloped, then actually in some ways you might end up not wasting your money, but you're not getting as much bang for your buck in terms of your restoration there. And if you only have a limited amount of funding, which we often do, then sometimes it's maybe better to direct your efforts towards somewhere where you know you're going to get a lot more for the resources you're going to put into it. So that's just a bit of background into that. And as Roisin already showed you there for Cuilcagh, we got restoration plans done for a lot of our sites. This again is cranny. From that restoration, or from the restorability, the guys in RPS were able to then say to us, okay, these are where you would want to, these are where your drains are, and then these are where you would want to put in all of your dams, and they prioritized them based on how sort of influential those dams were going to be. And then it was up to us basically to go out and take a look and figure out where and how awkward and what kind of techniques we were going to use then in order to try and install these dams and hold up this water. So that was the next step. And one of the main ways then we use, as Roisin already showed you on Cuilcagh, is peat dams. So peat dams is kind of the best and cheapest and most sort of aesthetically in keeping technique. It obviously uses material which is readily available on the bog, peat, and it means that we're not incorporating any kind of foreign material or any man-made material into the site, which is always good. And I know that some organisations have actually strayed away from using other materials, but in some situations it's almost essential to use man-made materials if you want to get it right. But peat is always the first port of call. So you use a huge, big, ridiculous digger on these sites. That machine there, which was out in Moneygall Bog only in February of this year, is 13 tons, which is pretty big, although it sits on over a metre wide tracks and then on bog mats, which are 5 metres wide by a metre deep, in order to spread the weight of it like a big snowshoe. And you need a reasonable sized machine in order to actually have the power in order to dig the dams and build the dams. So as Roisin pointed out, that you dig a borrow pit where you steal all of your peat and then you bund into the drain basically to hold up the water. And what we've ended up finding out actually is that the borrow pits, although they might seem like a bit of damage to start off with and it's a bit sort of invasive, they've actually turned into some of the nicest bits of bog whenever they've started to repair and regenerate over the next couple of years. So I was out on Tully Bog out near Oma there the other day, and the borrow pits now are some of the best bits of raised bog that we actually can see. They're full of sphagnum, lovely little shallow pools. So actually what seems at first like a bit more destructive ends up being really positive in the long run. But as you can see from the right-hand picture there in Moneygall, they do the job. And actually the benefit of the peat dams is that once you put the peat in and the water builds up behind them, the peat actually just swells more and it acts more like a bund, proper bund, that will just lock in that water and raise it back up to within that 10 centimetre window that really we want it to be in. And the benefit of these is that we with all of the restoration measures is that in the wintertime the bog is wet anyway, but actually what we want is during the summertime, whenever the water level would drop dramatically because of the drains, the dams prevent the water level from dropping very quickly and too low. they keep the water table higher during those stress periods when the bogs actually start to emit CO2 if they're too degraded. But it's not the only method that we use in order to block drains. So peat dams is one, plastic dams is another. So traditionally use these plastic piling sheets, which just have like a tongue and groove sort of fit into them. And you drive one in, then you slot the next one in, you drive it in, and you use these big sort of cartoonish animated rubber mallets in order to drive them in. These youngsters out near Drumquin had the task of installing over 250 of these across one of the ferry water bogs over last winter. And they're really in areas where either you're too worried about bringing a big machine out onto a site, whether that's because you're worried about damaging the site or whether that's because you're worried about losing the machine. Then you can use plastic dams because they're a bit more easily transportable. You can bring them out on the back of a quad and a trailer or some other kind of smaller machinery and drop them beside the drains, and then they're installed by hand. They're quite costly, but they're very, very effective. Obviously, they're completely watertight. We only would use them in situations where peat dams definitely aren't an option. But we've done great work with them across areas like the ferry water bogs here, which are some of the best bogs that we have in Northern Ireland already. And that was why we made the decision in many of them that we didn't want to bring big machines out onto them, because actually they are quite risky from a machine perspective, but also we didn't want to cause any harm to them. So bringing small numbers of or small teams of people out to install plastic dams is actually a much better option. And now, as you can see, there's the results speak for themselves. So that's great. And this is where you have a really big buildup of water, where actually what happens is it doesn't seem like it because the water is not moving particularly quickly. But if you have a huge drain, which actually has quite a lot of water moving through it, then and you put a peat dam in there or an ordinary plastic dam, eventually with the sheer weight of water you would get behind it, it would eventually possibly, or it's highly likely anyway, it would punch through it. So it would actually end up failing. And you don't want that to happen in the long run, it being just a waste of money. So this is what's called multi-lock plastic piling, which is much stronger and much sturdier. And within those sort of hexagonal things there, then you can drive a post down in it to act as extra structure. And they can withstand that extra pressure then in those big drains where you want to stop the water from flowing out. So this is a huge drain that we only actually found after we cleared loads of rhododendron on one of the ferry water bogs. And that we consequently went in then and blocked using this multi-lock stuff. It is nightmarish to put in though. It is really hard. Banging that in with a sledgehammer is brutal. But it does the job. And then one of the methods that we used really recently, actually, which was only in this specific situation did we think we would give it a go. This is a huge drain away out on Gary Bog, which is way up near sort of North Antrim, not far away from Ballymoney. And this massive drain was dug in for forestry, but they ended up not planting the bog and it was designated as an SAC. And it really drains a huge amount of water off the site, causing untold kind of damage. But it's far too big in order to put a standard peat dam in. And actually, it would have been really expensive to use the multi-lock plastic stuff in the quantities that we needed it. So we were advised to try this technique called peat timber sandwich dams, which is basically where the digger builds up half a peat dam, and then a couple of guys come in and get an 8x4 sheet of ply, and they lay it up, and the digger just pushes it in on one side, and then they get the other one in, and they push that in the other side, and then he builds peat back over it again. And it basically just provides support to the dam on such a big scale then to stop it from failing. And on this particular site, those poor guys had to install about 100 of those, which may seem like it would take forever, and I genuinely thought that it was going to take forever, but they ended up actually putting in over 100 of these in just shy of about 5 days, which is really impressive. But it's only really needed in certain situations where you have that huge amount of water, but it definitely does the job. And then moving on to slightly different problems that we get on some of our lowland peatlands. So invasive species is a big problem across all host of habitats, but on lowland peatlands, one of the big problems we have is rhododendron, or in peatlands in general, actually, we have rhododendron as a huge issue. So was usually restricted to estates back in the kind of Victorian era, and then it just started to get out and became widespread. It loves this particular species, Rhododendron ponticum, really loves the acidic soil, the acidic peaty soil that we get in our bogs, and so it spreads like wildfire in plenty of places. This is Tully Bog just outside Omagh, and the problem with it is that it just completely shades out everywhere, but it also actually leaches cyanide like toxins into the ground, which then kills other plants nearby it. So we really are kind of obligated to come in and try and take it out, and it is very difficult to take it out. You basically have to come in and cut it, remove it, treat the stumps with some sort of herbicide, which you have to do specifically on the stumps so as you don't destroy or harm any of the other surrounding vegetation. And removing it is really, really troublesome. I don't know how many people are aware of rhododendron, the way it grows, but it grows in this spindly kind of all over the place tangle of knotted, wiry, woody stems, and it is just horrible to get rid of. I can speak from first-hand experience. But we made a lot of effort, actually. We've removed hectares and hectares of rhododendron from a number of sites, and now those areas are completely open again for the sphagnum and the other native peatland species in order to thrive underneath. So that's something, but there's a heck of a lot more work to do. Peatlands Park, for one, is we've actually removed somewhere in the region of about 30 odd hectares of peatland, or of rhododendron from Peatlands Park, and there's still tens of hectares still to be removed. And the big problem with it is that if you don't keep at it and treat it every year following any of the regrowth, it'll just come back. So it's a nightmare, in short. And this is just some of the imagery here to show. So this was this huge blob of rhodie that had swallowed up this pine tree. And this is the area then after we removed it. So it just shows you there how effectively, once it grows up around an area, everything underneath just disappears. It just dies. And all the leaves gradually fall off. And as they decay, then they just poison the soil. So it's a massive problem in some areas. And then creepy little conifers is also a big problem, as Roisin's already pointed out, and it's a problem in some of the lowland sites as well as the upland ones. So a lot of our peatlands have historically actually been planted up with non-native conifers, and then that means that some of the areas that have been left open, they end up being colonised by a lot of these areas, and they dry out the bog and they shade it out as well. So they can be a real nightmare, and it's best and easiest to get them out whenever they're small. So it's an area of Moneygall away out in West Tyrone near the border with Donegal. And we went in and removed loads of these tiny little saplings. You can see the before picture there. Hundreds and hundreds of them. Thankfully, you don't need to treat them. But we got rid of a whole pile of them off there, which is great, because that means then now that they're not going to grow up to be full-scale trees, where they're much more problematic to get rid of. So then another wee Slido poll then. So just wanted to ask you, what things do we need to consider whenever we're working on bogs, and what issues do we need to be aware of or plan for when doing this work? And it's kind of to get your opinion on what you think those things might be. And we've learned a lot of lessons over the past wee while, but curious to get everybody else's thoughts. So
yeah, just like one or two words, folks. Nothing. No, yeah.
Political statements that might take up quite a while.
Yeah, just some of the things that might make it more difficult. Yeah.
Machine damage, definitely.
Absolutely.
Very sort of on point whenever we move to the next slide. Land conflicts, yeah, that's a real. That's very broad. I mean, that's everything from agriculture to turf cutting to forestry to recreation. There's a lot of conflicts of use when it comes to peatlands.
And I would say definitely by working with the landowners up in Cuilcagh, it definitely really helped us kind of give buy-in to the work that we were doing.
Yeah, and I mean we've done a lot of great work actually working with the landowners on all of these sites.
Yeah,
they get the best buy-in that's possible, and they're happy with the stuff we've been doing.
Yeah, you said it with the rhododendron as well, didn't you, Simon?
Yeah, we did. Yeah, health and safety is a big one. We've done that a lot. When you're working beside a huge digger all the time, that's also a very health and safety conscious environment. Impact on neighbouring lands, yeah, that's something we have to be very conscious of as well.
And that's why the LiDAR is quite important.
Yeah. Site damage, yeah, that's a big issue potentially as well. You don't want to, cut off your nose to spite your face, cause so much damage to a site by trying to restore it. You end up square one. Disturbing wildlife, that's also a big issue. That's why we need to do works at certain times a year in order to make sure we cause the least disturbance. Land ownership, oh my word, that's a can of worms and 3/4, for goodness sake. We have a completely different land ownership system here in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland compared to the likes of England or Scotland, where they tend to have big, massive areas of land that are owned by single individuals or estates. So you might have one landowner that owns 90,000 hectares in Scotland, and here in Northern Ireland, we have one bog, which is only 76 hectares and has 19 landowners on it. So it makes things ever so slightly more challenging. Cost, that's big one. It's not cheap.
Yeah.
Cheap.
Simon, I'm conscious that we've only 15 minutes left and people have covered a lot of this, so we might fly through the last few slides because there's a few questions coming in there as well. But yeah, most people have kind of hit the nail on the head with what they're coming up with here. Yeah.
And this was just to give you an insight there. People mentioned machine damage and habitat damage. This was what happened to us on Tully Bog. So this is where you don't want to be, with a digger completely bogged up to the cab. But sometimes that was really scary, and actually we wanted to remedy that very quickly. But on the next slide then, I remember going out on the Moneygall Bog and I could see something in the distance. I couldn't quite tell what it was, and as I got closer, I ended up just laughing because I thought to myself, actually it looks like I can't even tell where he went in. Like there's no damage anywhere around him. It's almost like somebody just dropped it from the sky and he got stuck in there. But this happens and you just have to deal with it and try and minimize the damage that comes out the other end. But that's why we do things like bog mats, and the operators of the machines are probably one of the most crucial things there is. And a lot of them are low ground pressure, which again is a must when working on these sites. And then logistics, huge thing that we have to think about. We had to transport over 400 coir logs, which had come from donkeys distance away in the back of a shipping container, bring them up to the Cavan Park in West Cavan into the Republic of Ireland, and then fly them using a helicopter across the border into Northern Ireland up onto the hill in the exact bundles and numbers we needed them in order for the farmers to install them in the correct places across different areas of the hill. So there was untold calculations on the back of fag packets done, which were then just thrown away and then back to square one. But it takes a lot of forward planning in order to get to where we are now. And the weather definitely does not allow for sitting back and twiddling your thumbs. So we've had everything from snowstorms to completely frozen over peat. Lochotona actually froze completely over one time where you could nearly walk on it. And then misty conditions where you couldn't see anything. The helicopter actually could barely get up at one stage. That just everything can be thrown at you, and that's something you need to be conscious of whenever you're doing this kind of work. And then, as somebody already mentioned there, we need to think about disturbance to wildlife. So we actually had to do some breeding bird surveys there on Gary Bog while the work was being done, just to ensure that we weren't going to be disturbing any birds which had already started to nest there. So that's something we need to be really conscious of and keep on top of where we're doing this work. And unfortunately, that means why we have to do it during the winter time most of the time. And when we're doing the work as well, the maps and the plans need to be checked on the ground, because sometimes the mapping doesn't pick up exactly what's going on the ground. They might find a deer track or an animal track and say that it's a drain, and they might actually miss certain things sometimes. So we need to spend a lot of time actually going out and seeing what the map says and correcting it and feeding it back, because it saves us time and money in the end. Okay, so.
Great. So we have, we went a wee bit over, but I suppose we answered a few questions there in the middle. So we have a question there about, will there be any output from CAN project in terms of manual or guidance videos on upland peatland restoration? And will there be ongoing monitoring of the restored sites? after the CAN project finishes in September. So yeah, we have been working on a couple of manuals and guidance videos. It's our partners at Armagh Bridge Craigavon Council that have been heading that up. So Simon's been up in front of the camera a couple of times as well. So we're hoping to have a few kind of best practice guides or kind of lessons learned, similar to what we've done here today about, I wish we had known this before starting the work. So yeah, definitely there'll be a lot of sharing a best practice. I think we've done a couple of workshops in that through CAN too. And then in terms of the ongoing monitoring, we'd love to see the monitoring happening after CAN, just so we've got that longer term data set. But it's kind of the difficulty when it comes to these sorts of projects once the funding finishes, is trying to find that next project to continue on. And so we will be applying for more funding to try and get a longer term data set, especially on the drain blocking. So we've got our year before, but it could take a couple of years for us to see the differences that we want to see up there. So yeah, you're kind of just at the mercy of the funders when it comes to working in the environmental sector sometimes, aren't you? And then Simon, the next one is, how is Argyry cut over bog? Ever used a winch to remove small rhododendron? I'm not sure.
The Argyry definitely is cut over bog, from what I'm aware of it anyway. I don't know it that well, but
yeah,
cut over from what I know. And I know that the ABC Council has been looking at doing restoration work on there with National Trust. So that keep an eye on for future work going on. I've never used a winch to remove small rhodie. That's something that we'd be perfectly willing to try. Some of them can be really nightmarishly well rooted in, and that's actually why they come back really vigorously at times. But I've not used a winch yet, Phil. Perfectly happy if you want to come up to us how to do it.
Yeah, do you want to take the next one there too, actually?
Yes, Megan asked there, how long after rhododendron has been removed do other species begin to grow again? So the kind of magical number, or rough number anyway, that we kind of work by is usually you need to go in and get rid of it initially in 1 year, in year one. And then in year two, you need to come back and cut and control any regrowth and do the same again in year three. And by year three, you should be starting to see things maybe change in the other direction, where more native species should be starting to grow up and take hold. But going back for maybe another following year or so after that, you probably will get some rhododendron coming back. And in some cases, it may well be a fight for 5, 6, 7 years before you really start to see it completely gone. And I know in places like in Donegal or down in Killarney, I mean, it's at the scale where you would be doing it for a generation before you would get rid of it, if not more. So it takes quite a while. And Phil, their laurel and rhodo leaves lose toxicity after 3 years of composting. Oh, well, you put a question mark beside that, Phil. I don't know whether you're asking the question or whether you're telling me that. I have no idea whether or not they do that. If that is true, then that's actually really interesting. We've started actually using some of the rhododendron that we've cut off Peatlands Park to turn into charcoal. We actually got charcoal burners. It burns really, really well. Rhododendrons are really like tough, hard, kind of tightly knotted wood, and it burns brilliantly. So for charcoal, for barbecues, it's really good. So if you see an Ulster wildlife stall on the side of the road selling rhodie barbecue charcoal, then you'll know that's us. And Phil said, you said there, I'm assuming that you mean a digger was lost on the Garran.
I think I heard that, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised at all. That's it's a hell of a place up there, and there are plenty of spots in order to lose a digger. And
the local farmer, the local farmer said he knew there was a lake there.
Yeah, he definitely knew afterwards, anyway.
Yeah, afterwards.
Yeah. The number of times which I have been terrified watching machines going into very, very dodgy places is, I've done it enough times now for a lifetime. I don't want to do it much ever again, and unfortunately, I think I'm going to. Yeah, there's a lot of diggers that have been lost in places. I did hear a story of one down in Timor in Fermanagh where it was lost donkeys years ago, and it was just abandoned, and then the community came together and actually dug it out and started it again, and
Wasn't it a competition or something?
Yeah, it was meant to be like a sort of, like community event or something. It's not an old wives' tale. I don't know how many times I've told this, changed every time. But yeah, they apparently did start it up again and managed to get it out, which is, it was meant to be for like 10 years or something.
Yeah, I'd heard that too.
Crazy.
Ernie and Ruth Hunter then are asking, we can re-wet the bog, but damage from ammonia continues. It's interesting, when you re-wet the bog, it actually makes it more resilient against the ammonia damage. Yeah, the ammonia damage will still continue, but that's like another added benefit of doing this kind of work. It kind of makes these areas more resilient to those kind of pressures. But we have been doing a bit of ammonia monitoring too on the sites. And just for other people, then ammonia is like it's just a form of nitrogen that you get released kind of from storage and spread of manure and that from you know, so getting from fossil fuel burning as well. And it's a big pressure on our bogs because these areas are really nutrient poor habitats. So all the plants that you get there are really adapted to that. So when you start to get nitrogen in the form of this ammonia getting dropped down on the site from the air or through rainwater, that increases the nitrogen content of it, and it kind of starts to, those nitrogen loving plants outcompete our native peatland species, the kind of plants that you'd want to see there. So it's a big issue on our sites here, especially in Northern Ireland. Then any other questions then we're trying to get through before this finishes, Simon?
Phil said there that could we arrange a visit, and actually, I mean, I said before that a lot of them are on private land or not particularly accessible places, but it's probably something we could talk to some of the events team and the Ulster Wildlife about, to try and arrange an event on a weekend or something during the summertime, maybe, to go and
see we'll have bog days events for Cuilcagh in the summer, so definitely look out for that, and it'll be a chance to get up there.
Yeah. That's true.
Are the plastic dams removed after a period of time? I'm not aware of any other places that have removed them. I think they tend to be kept in place, don't they, Simon? Just to keep doing the job that they're put in there to do. Unfortunately, we don't like to be putting plastic in, but you need to in some of these situations.
That's it. I mean, they're only used, and we only use them in situations where there's absolutely no other options, and they cause more harm to the bog by going in with something, some other method than using the plastic. And once you put them in, it would cause a lot of harm to take them out because they're really in there, you know, like they're 1.5 or 2 meters long, and they're driven down so that they're only about within 6 inches to a foot above the turf. So it's very difficult to get them out once they're in. And I know it's not an ideal scenario because obviously we don't want to be putting plastic into wetland environments in particular, unless we absolutely have to. But I think we've kind of taken the mindset that when it comes to the pros and cons, the benefits definitely outweigh the negatives here. But that's why we're looking at other methods that we can use in order to try and reduce the man-made materials that we're using in these kind of scenarios. So things like the wool and everything, and those kind of looking at those kind of avenues, we'll hopefully try and come up with other solutions.
Yeah. And then will we just take one more here? How do we feel about peat compost, Simon? Not
great.
Not great. Yeah, very, very damaging to our peatlands, and just huge destruction to the habitats that are, as we were saying earlier, as rare as rainforests and as important as rainforests. And I think it's really around education. I actually think a lot of people don't realise when they're buying it how damaging that it actually is. So yeah, not great, Megan.
Yeah. No. We are getting a wee bit better in some places, but I think a lot of people would happily buy the alternatives if
absolutely
with them, but it's about educating people that are buying them, gardeners and everybody else, but also educating the suppliers so that they, well, not educating them, but generating an awareness within suppliers so that they actually stock them. So I mean, I was in Dobby's the other day, and they actually did have a good variety of peat-free compost. But it's
getting a lot easier to get, isn't it?
Yeah,
definitely. Well, that was good timing. I think we got through all the questions, and we've just hit 8 o'clock. So yeah, do you want to round us up then, Simon?
Yeah, so thanks very much, guys, for all coming along, and thanks for all your questions. And this, obviously, as I'm sure you're aware, isn't the only online winter talk within the series. So the next one is on exploring your rocky shore within Northern Ireland. And that's on the 4th of April at 7 p.m, hosted by our colleague Gala, who's the Living Seas officer. And you can check for all of the upcoming talks on ulsterwildlife.org/events. And if you're interested and you're not already, then you can look into becoming a member of Ulster Wildlife, and you can join for half price throughout, oh, that's old, January. This is what happens when I use the same templates for talks. But actually, one other thing just to point out there is that we're always looking for people to volunteer. We use a lot of volunteers within the peatland work, doing everything from cutting rhododendron to installing dams to water monitoring. So if you're interested, let us know. Go on there to ulsterwildlife.org/volunteer and follow the instructions there, and definitely follow us on social media, because we do try to get out as much imagery and videos of the stuff that we do onto Twitter, Facebook and Instagram as we possibly can. But yeah, thank you very much, folks, and hopefully we'll see you again at another talk in the future, or maybe out on the bog at some stage when we do an event.
Definitely. Yeah, thanks a million, folks. I really hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting and very practical and well presented. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. That was excellent.
Thanks, Tom.